Now, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, has announced an extra £3.5 billion for the removal of flammable cladding from buildings in England. It'll apply on properties over 18 metres, and a levy will be imposed on developers building certain new high-rise blocks. The government set up a £1.6 billion fund last year in response to the Grenfell Tower fire back in 2017, but it has been under considerable pressure to increase that amount. Thousands of flat owners are facing huge bills for safety improvements, and in many cases, people are unable to sell their homes. Well, Mr. Jenrick has been speaking in the House of Commons.
We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England. We continue to take a safety-led approach, and this funding will focus on the higher-rise buildings where the independent expert advisory panel tells us, time and again, the overwhelming majority of the safety risk lies, in line with the existing Building Safety Fund and the anticipated scope of the new Building Safety Regulator that we're establishing and will shortly be legislating for. This will ensure that we end the cladding scandal in a way that is fair and generous to leaseholders. Secondly, for lower and medium-rise blocks of flats, the risks are significantly lower, and the remediation of cladding is less likely to be needed. In many cases, it will not be needed at all. But where it is, costs can still be significant for leaseholders, which is why I'm announcing today that the government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less.
So that's Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary. Let's go to our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus at Westminster. And Damien, an extra £3.5 billion for the removal of flammable cladding. But fair to say there's been a pretty mixed reaction to that announcement.
Yes, there has. The government calls this, Robert Jenrick calls this the largest ever government investment in building safety. But from the opposition, we've had a pretty round condemnation of it, and particularly that distinction that you were hearing him draw there between those people living in high-rise blocks over 6 stories, over 18 metres, where they're saying this funding will go to cover all the costs of removing dangerous cladding, and the distinction with those who live in blocks that are lower than that, so 4 to 6 stories high, where people will have to take these loans and pay back £50 a month. Now, Labour, Tangam Debonair, responding in the House of Commons today, call that a betrayal of a promise made that no leaseholders would pick up any of the costs. Margaret Hodge, Labour MP, she's called it an outrage. She's saying, why should there be a distinction given on the height of your building? She said, fire doesn't discriminate between height. Neither should the government. They're failing leaseholders. And that's also something that the Grenfell survivors group, Grenfell United, have criticised, and the End Our Cladding campaign. They have said that this means that those who will be forced into debt just because of the height of their building. And one other thing that's been criticised too, and this time by Conservative MP, this was Stephen McPartland, he has said that this also leaves out many of the costs that people still face, which are costs for elevated insurance premiums. The government said it wants insurers to bring those down, but he said it doesn't address that. It doesn't address the other costs that people face in the wake of Grenfell, things like dealing with other fire safety issues, funding of waking watches. These are patrols that go around 24 hours a day, checking your building to make sure there's no fire, and all of those are the majority of costs for quite a lot of people who are not addressed by this, he said.
Damien, thank you very much indeed. Damien Grammaticus there at Westminster. And we can talk now to Tom Brothwell, who is living in a flat with unsafe cladding in Manchester and also owns a flat with unsafe cladding in Birmingham. So, Tom, thanks very much for being with us. Just tell us how you'll be affected by this government announcement of £3.5 billion.
Well, it's still very uncertain. This has been going on now for about 3.5 years since the tragic fire at Grenfell. The government has slowly tightened the laws since then to try and make homes safe, but they've failed to deliver on the financial solution. It's still very uncertain. Yes, there's more money going into the pot for high-rise. Mr. Jenrick says it will cover cladding. However, if you look at the prospectus and if you look at the application forms, there is a section in the Building Safety Fund for ineligible items. So not all items on the external walls are covered as part of this fund. And for both of my properties, we registered our intention last June, and we've had no offer of funding for either property since then. So we're in very uncertain times.
And what do you think roughly would be the cost of changing the cladding on both your properties?
I think my bill for the two would be about £120,000. It's very uncertain as to what grant funding we'll get, what will be covered and what won't. And as the reporter just alluded to, we are, burning through cash in the meantime on extortionate increases in insurance. Our insurance in Birmingham went up by 1,000%. Waking Watch, all of the money that could have been spent on making our home safe is just being wasted on, others profiteering.
And how worried are you? I mean, aside from the money, how worried are you about this unsafe cladding on your properties?
Well, I mean, we're working closely with the fire service. We're trying to do all we can to keep buildings safe, but there's lots of stakeholders to keep happy: the insurers, the fire service, risk assessors. People are worried. Everybody I speak to is worried about not only their financial situation, but their safety in their homes. And this has been going on for a really long time now. We're unable to sell our properties. We're unable to change the mortgage company we borrow from. We're essentially trapped, and it's completely unfair.
It is, and it's also such a long time since Grenfell, more than 3 years, as we've been hearing. And it's almost as if you'd asked somebody, a few days after Grenfell, whether it would be possible that 3 years later there'd still be this problem around the country, people would have thought, well, that couldn't happen, surely.
Well, we're absolutely delighted that the media are covering this in such detail now, because, when I speak to friends and family, they absolutely can't believe that we're in this position. We can't believe we've got these bills. We can't believe that homes aren't safe. And we've seen a U-turn from the government, who've been saying all along leaseholders shouldn't pay. And today they've saddled leaseholders in buildings below 18 metres with an extra £600 of charges per year indefinitely.
Tom Brothwell, thank you so much for being with us, living in a flat there with unsafe cladding in Manchester. Many thanks.